Great. Thank you so much for joining us. To those of us who are joining us in person and those colleagues and participants joining us online, I welcome you. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that McMaster University, here where we reside, sits on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee people, territory covered by the Dish with One Spoon, One Pan agreement. My name is Bonnie Ivao. I'm the project director of Participedia and a professor here in global human rights at McMaster University. It is indeed my pleasure to welcome you all to this last event in the Participedia Partners Conference for 2022. It's been 2 full days of deliberations, very productive deliberations, I might add, on participation, democratic innovation, civic inclusion. And it's been very delightful to welcome you all to McMaster University campus to this in-person conference. I think one of the first we've had since the lifting of COVID restrictions. We're really delighted to have you here. For those who are just joining us and might not know more about Participedia, Participedia is a global network of researchers, policymakers, practitioners, activists, and anyone interested in democratic innovation, public participation, and civic inclusion. We encourage you to learn more about our project and our network at participedia.net. We have a very exciting conversation today, and I'm joined by a very distinguished group of panelists, experts in democracy, who are all part of the Participedia team, and we're going to be deliberating on the important topic of democracy in times of crisis. You will all agree with me that we live in troubled times. Democracy is increasingly under strain. There is a rise in populist authoritarianism. Disaffected citizens and electoral majorities are living exclusions, fostering inequalities, and living injustices unaddressed. Human rights are increasingly under assault in many parts of the world, and basic capacities for collective provisions of welfare and security are increasingly becoming absent. Current global crises, from wars as those in Ukraine and in Yemen, climate change, the COVID pandemic, refugee flows, collective insecurity, inequalities, xenophobia, and toxic forms of digital communication all pose threats to democracy where it exists and stall progress where democracy is weak or emergent. How do we respond to these crises? How do we address these varied and growing threats to democracy around the world? This today is the subject of the discussion by our panelists, and the plan here is to have each panelist give a 7-minute opening presentation addressing the key question of how we address threats to democracy, first identifying what threats they think are most significant, and then following up with some comments on how those might be addressed. And after each of the 7 minutes opening remarks, the presenters will go back and we will have a conversation that expands on some of their presentation. The hope is that at the end we will have time to field questions from both our audience here at McMaster University and those who are joining us online. Once again, I welcome you and I thank you for joining us. So I'll just briefly introduce the distinguished speakers who we're privileged to have with us here today. And I'm just going to go by the order of sitting. The first is Dr. Mark Warren, who's the Harold and Doreen Marles Chair in the Study of Democracy and a professor of political science in the University of British Columbia. Mark was one of the initiators and the project director of Participedia Phase 1 when it was a UBC, and we're delighted to have him here today. The next is Dr. Francois Monteboul, Associate Professor the Université de Montreal, who is also a cluster lead for Participedia and an active member of Participedia Phase 1 and Participedia Phase 2. We are also joined by Dr. Fiona Anciano, who's an associate professor at the University of Western Cape in South Africa. The other members of the panel are joining us remotely. Professor Bagang He, the Alfred Deakin Professor and Personal Chair in International Relations at Deakin University in Australia, and Dr. Amel Joseph, who's a professor who holds the professorship in Equity, Identity, and Transformation, and is the academic director, community engaged research and relationships, an associate professor in the Department of Social Work here at McMaster University. I'm delighted to have them all. So I'll just call on Mark to begin the conversation. Thank you, Mark.
Well, hello everyone. It's great to see everyone again. Thank you, Bonnie, and thank you especially to the team that has put together this conference, this panel, with such competence, warmth, and grace. Bonnie asked us to begin by addressing the question of the most significant challenges to democracy today. In my view, there are many of them, but the outstanding one is, of course, authoritarianism. Now, this is a long-standing way of thinking about democratic challenges, but I think there are a couple of increasingly important features of this dichotomy between democracy and authoritarianism that we recognize, but I think don't fully grasp. First of all, the older kinds of authoritarian challenges to democracy were mostly, I think, direct and visible. They took the form of systems justified with non-democratic ideologies and mostly built without democratic institutions. Think, fascism, theocracies, totalitarian systems, or today, China with its explicit rejection of so-called Western systems in favor of an increasingly sophisticated paternalistic surveillance state. For the last couple of decades, however, authoritarians increasingly use nominally democratic tools, especially elections, to build something that looks like democratic legitimacy, but operates in authoritarian ways. Trump in the US, Modi in India, Erdogan in Turkey, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and so on. You know the list of cases and characters. Elected leaders such as these attack or otherwise undermine many of the institutions that democracies need. Strong human, political, and welfare rights, independent judiciaries that enable them, active and effective legislatures, professional bureaucracies, robust civil societies and public spheres, that are protected by liberal catalogs of rights and institutions, institutions that control corruption, and so on. And second, and maybe less obviously, we haven't been as forward-thinking as we need to be in appreciating the attractions of authoritarianism or autocracy. Standing back, we tend to think that the attractions of democracy are obvious, especially with a self-selected group like this. Better democracy is, there are good reasons for why we think like we do, right? Better democracy is closely associated with a broad range of goods, each of which underwrites basic ideals of self-development and self-determination. Democratic countries tend to rank highly for human development and human rights, education, the status of women. They tend to be more dynamic and more creative, freer, and so on. Autocracies tend to be associated with corruption, poverty, inequality, and too often war and even genocide. Democracies do not automatically solve these issues, but they hold up ideals and they provide more pathways to address them. But democratic institutions can stall in ways that make authoritarian leaders seem attractive. They can produce gridlock. They can leave people behind. The institutions can be captured by elites. Autocrats, for their part, can claim to represent the people, the disaffected, silent majorities, ethno-national cultures, and the people against global elites. Notice that these are all quasi-democratic ways of formulating the attractions of strong leaders. They can promise to get things done without the troublesome checks of institutions that are probably themselves captured by elites against the people. We Democrats are pretty good at denouncing authoritarianism. We're less good at analyzing its attractions, especially those motivated by the failures of some kinds of institutions associated with democracy. And so we leave open so-called democratic pathways to authoritarianism. We need to do a better job of diagnosing democratic deficits within nominally democratic systems, especially those that enable authoritarians to organize the discontents and disaffections that we Democrats should be recognizing, reframing, organizing, and connecting. So what's to be done? Now, there are lots of strategies. Only a few of them are academic, but that's what we do, and those are the ones that we can mostly address. First, we need to identify democratic deficits so we can plug these holes faster than authoritarians can organize them. This set of problems points in both general and specific directions. At the general level, we need to continue to develop democratic systems approaches that build on the general ideals that make democracy attractive and help to identify system-specific democratic deficits, that is, institutions and practices that fall short of or block democratic ideals. And then second, we need to think about specific kinds of democratic innovations that speak to specific kinds of deficits. Substantively, we need to figure out what it means, what they mean in each kind of context. And this is where Participedia is important and hopefully will become much more important in phase 2 with its broader reach and fuller spectrum of what counts as democratic innovations. So that's why we're building out a range of democracy problems and powers that flow across borders, problems of basic human rights, problems of scale that can be addressed by representation, problems of responsiveness and corruption that signify a lack of accountability, problems and possibilities introduced by digital media, and of course, where we started, problems of democratic participation and governance. Where we are strong is in identifying those specific kinds of democratic supplements relevant to particular context-bound kinds of democracy problems and deficits, and in documenting the locally attentive system-specific inventiveness that remains with us while keeping an eye on the bottom line. That is, ways and means of governance that support self-development and self-determination of people, which is what democracy is ultimately about. What we need to hope is that projects like Participedia can spread the word, inspire, and inform faster than authoritarians can organize so that the democratic project does not fail. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark, for these opening reflections. I'm going to tap into one of the challenges that you're identifying. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this stimulating panel. So the question we were asked to collectively reflect upon is an important one. Are democracies in crisis? What are the main challenges contemporary democracies face today, North and South? And what does it mean, and this is the take I'm going to take here, for participatory democracy in particular? My initial reflections on these questions are grounded in the Latin American context, where my research have pushed me to pay more attention to everyday citizen democratic practices, which often fall off our radar when we think about democracy and public participation. So recent debates on the state of democracy in Latin America and beyond highlighted, like Mark just said, a worrying tendency to democratic backsliding in many countries of the region, a phenomenon that's also been called democratic decline, democratic erosion, and so on. So at the core of this concept is the idea that democratically elected leaders are using democratic mechanisms to fragilize and weaken, and even in some cases eliminate existing democratic institutions from within. This gradual process manifests itself by an increase in authoritarian practices and a general decline in the quality of the democratic process within democratic settings. And several examples in Latin America have illustrated this trend in recent years. And among the important challenges being faced by democracies in Latin America is the gradual erosion of participatory democracy institutions, which is manifest, as many countries are currently experiencing, the gradual deinstitutionalization and even the dismantling of formal participatory institutions at all levels of government. It is of particular importance for the region, as it has long been considered one of the incubators of participatory democratic innovations around the world. It is indeed in Latin America that a variety of different participatory institutions and mechanisms have emerged at the local, regional, national, even transnational levels, especially in the post-transition in the 1990s, contributing to the strengthening of otherwise fragile democracies. And since then, participatory institutions of different types have gained visibility throughout the world and spread more intensely in the region during the 2000s, or the so-called pink tide in the region, under governments of the left committed to extending citizenship rights and fostering inclusion and participation of the traditionally excluded and underrepresented groups. Many cases can be cited, but obviously we can cite the flagship example of Brazil and its well-known participatory budgets and national conferences, national public policy councils, that are all participatory institutions that are under threat or gradually deinstitutionalizing nowadays. So is participatory democracy really in decline in Latin America, participating to accentuate the impression that democracy is indeed eroding or is in crisis in the region? So to start answering that question, I suggest we actually need to look a little on the sides of institutions beyond formal participatory institutions and move our analytical lens towards bottom-up and often informal citizen participatory practices and interactions. In fact, I would argue that democracy is not only embodied in formal institutions, it is a praxis that can be found in the everyday practices of citizens in what I would call forms of participatory citizenship. And these practices that are generally located in the day-to-day interactions at the local level and are observable in a variety of collective initiatives that are developed or invented by citizens themselves are very important to look at when we want to think about democratic resiliency. Why is it the case? Well, because in these initiatives, we can see spaces of resilience for citizenship, for democratic citizenship in action, where we can observe the politicization of everyday life through action, interactions, and imagine new ways of impulsing social change and of interacting with the state and political authority that do not feel as disconnected as the existing institutions. Examples of this are plenty in Latin America and beyond. We can think of urban activism as a space of democratic discussion in the public space, Activism that we saw yesterday is another space for discussion. Tactical urbanism, occupations of abandoned buildings as performative acts of the right to the city, etc. But I'd like to explore one case in particular just quickly to exemplify a little bit what I think are interesting and creative forms of democratic citizenship resilience. And this is the case of citizen-led collective gardens that has known an important increase in the past couple of years. They take different forms from place to place, but they're present in many Latin American cities, including Sao Paulo, Belo Horizonte, Mexico, Rosario, Buenos Aires, and so on. Those gardens are located in a public space without asking permission from city authorities. They are led by citizens, organized by citizens, and they are meant, obviously, as spaces to cultivate plants, fruits, and vegetables. But I also suggest that these spaces are emergent urban initiatives that are also fundamentally participatory, and such as they involve the direct participation of citizens, neighbors that need to organize themselves, that learn together through action. They're also political, even though they're not necessarily political from the beginning, or they're not claimed as being political, not framed as is. And they are organized outside of state institutions, but because they're located on public domain, obviously they become in contact with the state and with the political. And so they somehow become political, formally enter in interaction with public institutions and municipal authorities. And at least in certain cases, they become militant also. As they are collectives where local claims that have a national and transnational resonance are defined and organized. For example, claims for the right to the city, sustainable agriculture, the right and access to food, social inclusion, etc. So, just to conclude briefly, it's fair to say that among the challenges for Latin American democracy is indeed the deinstitutionalization of participatory institutions. However, forms of democratic citizenship resilience can be observed in citizen practices located in places and space outside of institutions that often fall off our usual analytical lens. They're not a panacea against democratic erosion, obviously. There are different problems and questions that are raised by these initiatives. However, they create collective and participatory spaces where new articulation of democratic representation, social mobilization, state-society interaction can emerge. And these should be better documented, better understood. And I think this is how Participedia in our community can be important and contribute. Thank you very much.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So again, thank you very much, Bunny, and everyone for the opportunity to engage in a really fascinating conversation. And I feel lucky to have gone third in this queue because I think what I'm going to say really builds on the previous two speakers. We didn't plan it, but that's how it's worked out. So just to contextualize my input, I'm from Cape Town. And I work very much in grounded research. I've been working in informal settlements for the last 15, 20 years with student research teams. So I'm going to reflect on democracy in crisis from that perspective. I want to specifically think about democratic practices, democratic innovations from the neighborhood level, the very lowest local level of representation we can think of, and often actually below levels of formal representation. And I want to do this specifically in relation to vulnerable populations. So I would agree broadly with the framing that citizens are cynical about the potential of democracy as a system that can hold potential for meaningful development in their lives. So what do I mean by that? Well, here I mean development as in the opportunities to build a sustainable livelihood, that includes stable income, protected human rights, and that very much in South Africa would include dignity, and reliable service delivery from local and national government. So I'm going to reflect firstly on several reasons why I think there is this cynicism about democracy. But then I'm going to end my reflections on a more positive note. Because while people are disenchanted with democracy, very much following from the previous speaker, actual democratic practices in the everyday are really flourishing if you look in the right spaces. So why the cynicism with democracy? So firstly, I'm basing this on about 10 years of fieldwork in one area of Cape Town. And this is a geographic ward, a representative ward, where you have a councillor. And this particular ward is broken down into 3 distinct neighborhoods. And if you look at this ward, it really forms, one might argue, a microcosm of South Africa, racially, socio-economically, amongst most indicators. So it's a really fascinating place to study because it gives you some insight as to how we can see broader processes. So having spent a lot of time there and done a lot of research and looked at moments of conflict and tried to unpack why is there conflict, what underlines this, we can see that there's really a distinctive disconnection between formal democratic processes and citizens' everyday experiences of governance. So in other words, many of the forms of government that impact the individuals in their daily lives, literally from waking up in the morning to going to bed at night and everything they do in between, is actually not linked to any formal representative process. For example, if you live in an informal settlement in a place called Imozamo and you have an issue with security, say your cell phone's been stolen, you don't go to the police. The police are there, they're visible. There is a police station on the edge of the settlement. But you go to the patrollers. Now, the patrollers are an informal vigilante group. They actually took over the local small building that was a library, and that was state-sanctioned that. They're about 200 meters from the police station. You go there, you pay them. If you're a man, it's about $10. If you're a woman, it's $5. Men pay more because they're expected to be part of the patrollers, and if they're not part of the patrollers, then they must pay a higher fee for services, and they will sort out your theft. They'll get your phone back, they'll figure out what's going on. And this is sanctioned by the police. The police, in fact, will admit off record that it's helping them do their job. So your everyday governance has got nothing to do with the state system. The same is actually relevant in a very different context if you're a wealthy citizen in the same ward, a kilometer away from this informal settlement. If your water services are disrupted, you don't wait for the state. You phone a plumber, you phone an individual, or if you've got a problem with a crime, you contact the neighborhood watch, which is run by a private network. So your everyday experiences really have little to do with the democratic processes you're engaging with. And so there is a distinct disconnection there. But I want to argue that there are many reasons for this disconnection, and it's not a lack of willingness to provide services on the part of government officials. At least I'm talking about in Cape Town in this particular context. We actually have a relatively efficient local government that works as hard as they can to deliver good services. An unintended consequence of corruption in the country has been that there are far more checks and balances in place now for municipal officials. If you work in the city of Cape Town, or any municipality in the country, you have a stack of forms to complete before you deliver any service. Because you have to show that you followed procedure, that you followed protocol, that there is no, that you're being compliant. And so if any project, any service delivery has to meet these compliance, and so this is an unintended consequence of attempted practices of good governance. And here we see this disconnection. Because you may have a good participatory project, or you may have citizens wanting to engage the state, and the state not able to provide what citizens are asking for if it isn't in their budget line and doesn't meet their compliance forms. So South Africa's local government is mandated to include participatory processes in their development projects and plans. But this compliance has meant it's largely turned into a tick box exercise. And we know this from studies around the world. It's not just in South Africa. Residents attend meetings, but policy choices are actually already decided way in advance. We're looking here at the low levels of Einstein's ladder of participation. And this hasn't fundamentally changed, even though policy and legislation says it should. So what's the second reason for dissatisfaction with democracy? A lot of research studies in South Africa have recently shown that residents in informal settlements equate the idea of democracy to that of freedom. And this is not surprising, given South Africa's apartheid history. But what is enlightening after our miracle transition in 1994 is that most citizens in informal settlements say that they don't feel free. Why don't they feel free? Because freedom for them is not political freedom to vote or freedom from harm. It's actually freedom to secure their material needs and ideally their aspirations. For many, if you can't get a job, you are not free. And if democracy was meant to deliver that form of freedom, it's failed. And therefore, there is a deep-set disenchantment with democracy. And yet, in my last minute, I want to say that if you spend a few weeks in any informal settlement and you follow processes, you will see so many forms of participation, representation, collective action, civic organization. I can guarantee, because a colleague wrote a book on this, that any single informal settlement you walk into, if you say, where is the AMO committee? Where is the committee? You will find a committee. There will be a committee leader, and there will be an active committee. A street may have 3 AMO committee, or it may have 1. A neighborhood may have 1, or it may have 10, and these are contested spaces. But they're profoundly active, engaged spaces. I'm not idealizing them. They're often also violent spaces. And the leader of an AMO committee may use violence as their form of condign power to actually have their authority. But they are contested, and if they don't deliver for the residents they're representing, there is someone else who will step up quickly to take that role. And there can also be different forms of exclusion, notably xenophobia quite recently, and this can be very visible. But apathy has not won out. And so I think it's important to capitalize on these active everyday spaces of participation and action. And there does need to be a much stronger and clearer link between government processes, these tick box exercises, and actually organic forms of organization and participation that are flourishing. To date, the state has set rules of engagement that I think it now needs to reflect on. And participation can't just be a bureaucratic process alone. And this isn't an easy equation to match, these organic processes and state processes, but certainly this is something that we in Participedia look at and understand and can help to take to a broader audience and engage with state actors to show how we can start to take forward and link up organic forms of organization with states and local governments that are willing and interested in meeting the needs of their citizens. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our presenters in person. We will now turn to our presenters online, and we'd like to start with Dr. Boagang. Hey, is Boagang ready to join us virtually?
Thank you. Can you see my slides? I have a few slides, and so then I can talk quickly. So I would like to address the 3 questions raised by Bonnie. First question, what do you consider the most significant challenge to democracy and participation today? I would like to take a new, fresh approach. That's geopolitics of democracy. So I think that currently the rival between United States and China is likely to impact democracy in the world. And it's obviously the American unipolar movement is over. So if we think about in the late 1990s, early 2000s, so those who work in the field of democracy really have a good time, because at that time, the America is really dominant power. Either you get funding, you go everywhere, you are welcomed. But now it's American democracy itself face a problem. So American democracy, in particular under Trump, is really trouble now. So the illusion of the American democracy is likely associated with a global decline of the democracy for some times. And one of the particular challenges is come from, as Mark said before, is authoritarianism, in particular from authoritarian state of China. So today, the China and the United States are likely to be co-determine the fate of democracy and human rights in the world. So probably we don't like this statement, but it is empirical fact. So China is as a kind of non-West and non-democratic country. It has a kind of second largest economic power. China becomes the largest credit to take the United States. So China provides more funding investment than the World Bank. And so Chinese Belt and Road Initiative has an impact Asia and Africa everywhere. So if China model were confirmed by many Asian and African countries, so one of the issues is how do we understand it? We leave this issue for the moment. Were it to replace the Western model of democratization among some third world countries, where China prolong authoritarianism in Africa and Asia? I think those are really deep challenges. So how to address those challenges? So I would like to suggest a different kind of third way. The third way is let's us to develop a proper, adequate understanding of what's so-called China model, and in particular what's so commonly regarded as authoritarianism of China. And so I would like to abandon the Biden's slogan that's a very simplistic, polarized dichotomy between democracy and autocracy. Biden always divided this world into either democracy or autocracy. So in one of his speech, he said probably his grandson, probably in their PhD thesis, will discuss this issue of the triumphalism of autocracy. But my point is that this kind of simplistic polarization, categorization does not catch the reality. So I will look at this issue, take example, Belt and Road Initiative. So if we look at the Belt and Road Initiative, look at its relationship with the political regime, it's very complicated. We really need to develop a complicated understanding of the China and the Chinese authoritarianism and its impact on the democracy. So let me take example of the BAI. So Belt and Road Initiative is really about infrastructure, build the road, connect the country to country, connect the railway from one continent to another continent. So if we think about that, this BAI is a political neutral insofar as it aims to connect country and country and continent and continent irrespective of regime type or political incarnation. Whether you are democracy or authoritarianism, they will build a railway anyway. So it's a political neutral. So empirically, we can say China has been working with a liberal democracy like the Greece, Italy, when they have a financial crisis. So they help them. And one of the very important facts is that China is learning that the well-functioning democracy actually reduces the corruption and the risk for Chinese BAI project. So one of the very important facts, if we look empirically, look at where does Chinese money go in terms of investment. The largest country, the United States, receives the largest proportion of Chinese foreign investment, followed by Australia, UK, Canada. So what we see is really clearly the Chinese company follow the economic logic. When they have a well-functioning democracy, then they invest more. So at the same time, probably the way also when the Chinese money go, they want to influence the host government, the regulation. Then China has been kind of start to interference, domestic politics of the liberal democracy in Australia, in Canada. They have provided some the money lobbying group. So that's another challenge for all the liberal democracy, how to resist authoritarian interference. But so that's one aspect. The other aspect, probably the most accommodate is right. This is kind of authoritarian government are more pro BER than democracy one. So most we already say the United States, Australia reject Chinese BERs, and then if we think the Chinese, they claim their success of BER. Almost those successful countries are the top 5 countries. They are participating Chinese BER, Russia, Kazakhstan, Thailand, Pakistan, Indonesia. Except Indonesia, all the first 4 are authoritarian state. So there's a kind of, I call this kind of regime of affinity, that the Chinese BER tends to work with more authoritarianism. And there are a number of reasons for that. We don't have time to explain, but there's so then the question is whether the BER recipient countries become more susceptible to authoritarian division if they embrace Chinese model of development. So Chinese model of development is largely focused on the development, government actions, and you need a very powerful, competent government, and you focus on economic, social rights rather than political, civic rights. So, clearly we see this China model stands in sharply contrast to Western model. So where the assumption of liberal democracy is a natural reference point to development and leadership. But China offers a different one. And last year in Pakistan, they approached me. They tried to discuss, they said this kind of two-party system, multi-party system don't work for Pakistan because you always change the government. Then it's not good for economic development. They want to build a long-term party who can deliver the long-term stability. Then they can deliver political economic development. So clearly we see those kind of impact happening in South Asia. So one of the issues, as Mark earlier mentioned, the issue is attraction of the Western liberal democracy. So if the Western democracy model had only succeeded in rich developing states, there would be likely not to appetite for Chinese alternative. I think that precisely the Western model, when they emphasize civic political rights, and they does not pay a substantial attention to the development agenda, and then suddenly China model become more attractive. So the issue is how do we deal with those issues? And rather than I think we suggest, rather than we suggest how to deal with, I would like to look at the Chinese own innovative solution to some of the problems they face. So yesterday I mentioned a number of this kind of Chinese innovation, like infrastructure project, embrace the Japanese style quality investment standards. So Japanese always emphasize quality. So Chinese also do kind of similar kind of things now. The last year, the China-European Union Comprehensive Agreement on the investment, including provision of protection for workers' rights. So recently, China had a scholarly conference discuss this investment and human rights, but then they focus on this economic social rights. And in places such as Sri Lanka, a lot of posts, they announced that let's do extensive consultation, joint contribution, share benefit. So China started to establish a kind of public consultation mechanism in BR receiving countries. So this is a very interesting kind of new development. China had this local public consultation mechanism at home. Now they want to be on board. They reinforce the rights to trade union in Brazil, but when the Chinese company take over some local one, then they will hire the professional. Then they will keep all the trade union. Do as you do.
I hate to interrupt, but could you just please round up? We have one more speaker and we're running out of time.
Yeah, okay, so I stop. So just, I'm finishing now. The first is setting anti-corruption ambassador to be a country. The other is a monitor of a Chinese company. So all those challenges, I think, is one of the issues probably we need to come back to this Participedia. We need to documenting the Chinese new effort. In particular, there are some authoritarian sophistication control mechanisms there. So this is a way we can aware this kind of those kind of issues. Sorry, I stopped here. Sorry, I take so too.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate your intervention. And if I might add, it's I think 4 a.m. or 3 a.m. in Australia where Dr. Boangang is joining us. So we really do appreciate him doing this live. He could have, just recorded a video for us to play, but he stayed up late. So thank you very much. We have just one last speaker to speak for 7 minutes before we go into the conversation, so if we have time. So I'm delighted to invite Dr. Amir to please make his interventions on this question.
Conversation. Thanks for inviting me to be a part of it. I sometimes get lost when we have idealized conversations around democracy and conversations about rights. As some of you may know, maybe many don't, my work in particular has been surrounding issues of mental health and disability and criminal justice. I study and work on matters of race and racism. I think about the legacies of coloniality and ableism in policy and practice and law. That has connected me to grassroots community organizations and initiatives and activism for many years. It is the kind of thing that frames what I do today. I have been, I'll begin by talking about the kinds of things that I have been more worried about as of late, and with some of the things that I have been more hopeful about. When I think about democracy, I have been moved to think about what it means to be engaged with communities and populations around very particular issues. I think about representation. I think about participation in ways that are outside of what we traditionally think of in terms of governance in the ballot box. I've been more concerned as of late with resistance to participation at the local level and at national and sometimes international levels. What some people know about Hamilton is that it is well known for having the highest number of police reported hate crimes in the country. It is a city that has long struggled with matters of hate and racism and discrimination. We also just happen to have the highest per capita proportion of people who identify as disabled. On top of that, we also made some national and some international news about the ways we have been antagonizing those without housing, those who are homeless, through the ways that apparatus of the state, police, and the city has intervened to destroy encampments, the people who have to live in tents because they don't have housing. Those are the kinds of things that I feel people are deeply concerned about. They're deeply concerned about issues related to environmental crisis and climate change. It's not that they haven't been engaged. Hamilton has been a prime example of mobilizing solidarities for social action in very nuanced ways. And these are the kinds of things I'm hopeful about. I'll share with you an example in a minute, but some of the other things that I'm concerned about are the ways that initiatives that claim to be about democracy sometimes don't confront the very real ways that democracies are intruded upon by nefarious actors. We have widespread knowledge now of the ways that knowledge is manipulated through misinformation and disinformation, the ways that hate groups and organized malicious groups have wielded misinformation to influence democracies. We have widespread information about ways that hate groups have been attacking people who have been addressing or trying to address issues of inequity, issues of injustice and disparities for what we traditionally respond or call or encapsulate as equity-seeking groups or marginalized groups or deserving groups. When I think about matters of racism and ableism and criminal justice and homelessness, I'm thinking about what does it mean when we've designed systems that have been acting to attack those who are trying to raise matters that are important to them about matters of crisis that are their crises, when they don't seem to be, in the broad sense, appreciated as crises that need to be addressed at an aggregate level that matter to all of us, both locally, nationally, and internationally. I'm worried about those kinds of things and the ways we don't talk about them when we have idealized conversations about democracy and rights. What I'm hopeful about is some of the ways that local examples of resistance has shown us something different. One of the examples I'll share briefly is some of the local work here to address inequities during the pandemic. There were widespread conversations about racial and racial disparities around where COVID-19 infections were landing in Hamilton. And some over 50% of early cases were landing on Black, Indigenous, and other racialized groups, as well as people who are living in more marginalized areas of Hamilton, some low-income areas of Hamilton, as well as people with disabilities. There were conversations about what we do about this. Organizations and organizational leaders mobilized to bring forward these conversations at provincial levels, the provincial healthcare system, at local levels, with the municipalities and public health, and they went nowhere. What they decided to do next was mobilize online through press conferences and letter campaigns in ways that countered the different disinformation that was being spread online about what was happening with the pandemic. Through that advocacy, they were able to establish on their own a clinic that prioritized these groups for vaccination. It was the kind of thing that community leaders, local advocates, and local community health center leaders were able to intervene upon in ways that changed a political agenda. I think the ways we talk about democracy have to be really specific. I think we need to be thinking about the ways misinformation and disinformation is intruding upon the ways we conceptualize and analyze problems and their solutions, as well as how it disillusions populations and how they engage in matters when they don't feel like they're impactful. You know, when we antagonize the most vulnerable in our communities and we don't do anything to support them, and we allow for that antagonism to continue, how can you talk about democracy and rights? I think we have to be more radical in some of our conversations. But I see that I'm out of time, so I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. So we have about 10 minutes more. We have a hard stop at 4:30 because this is an international conference. We have participants from all over the world who have flights to catch today to go back to their destination. So we'll keep it at that. I had a slew of questions to ask, but I will kind of frame the conversation just along two lines, and anyone of the panelists could take this on. Because what we've heard today are two very distinct dimensions of participation. So we had speakers who talked about participation at a very global, international, and transnational level. So Dr. Boagang's discussion of, Chinese authoritarianism and the difficulties and challenges of the rather polarizing categorization of democracy against authoritarianism, and, the other speakers. But we also hear from Dr. Amil Joseph, a very grassroots notion of participation. And so there seems to be both the global and the local in dialogue here in how we think about participation. So my one question is this. Now that we've identified the challenges and also some of the promises in democratic participation, how can Participedia and research, and when I say research here, I'm not just talking about academic research, I'm talking about, activist research, active engagement. How can we respond to these deficits? So I would like someone to speak to the big picture global, and then maybe get one of the speakers to speak to the more grassroots kind of how we respond to these challenges. So who wants to go first?
Don't do grassroots, sorry.
We don't have to have a debate about this. Come on.
I'll add my few cents worth on the grassroots. So I think what Participedia is really well placed to do is provide evidence-based learning. So I guess one thing I would think in a concrete sense, we have these officials, we have democratic representatives that we choose and we elect, but what information are they getting access to? What are they hearing? What do they respond to? And they're just people like you and I. They need information and data. And Participedia is really excellent at giving evidence-based research of processes and saying, look here, this is happening. How do we use it? And I think, one of my own challenges to myself is my 3-year goal is to meet the city, take my case studies, talk to officials. Don't see this barrier of I'm an academic and you're a representative, or you're there and I'm there. My role isn't only to study you, it's actually to talk to you too. So I think that's one concrete way in which Participedia can actually take what we do forward.
Great. Anybody else want to expand on that?
I could say a word as well. I think Participedia is also very well placed because of the composition of the team. And I think we're very well placed to produce evidence-based data, but in a comparative way and a dialogue with practitioners as well. And so I think that makes us a really rich community to engage in discussion, problem solving eventually, and dialogue with policymakers.
Mark, what's your 2 cents on this?
Okay, my 2 cents is that I'm a little bit older than the rest of the panel, and I've seen a little bit more. I have been impressed over the course of my lifetime at the global emergence of human rights discourses, the spread of democratic values, the pushback against autocracies and elites. One of the things that, this gives me hope. I think there are some important structural drivers of these value changes. My talk was a little bit pessimistic, but I am a long-term global optimist. Participedia is helping translate these values across contexts and borders. So the things that unite us are actually quite universal, value-wise. They have specific kinds of take-up dependent on specific kinds of places and problems. But we don't want that to overshadow the common solidarities that are building around values like human rights, and then expressive values that go into grassroots democracies. One more thing. One of the interesting things about this unbelievable tragedy, and it's not a tragedy, that's the wrong word, the invasion of the Ukraine, is the rapidity, the quickness with which the European West mobilized. It is, so developed democracies can be a little bit cynical about their own democracies, but then when it's visible what the costs are of letting basic institutions be crushed, that is a kind of reminder that there actually is, no matter how imperfect the institutions, there are things to fight for within them, and ways and means of fighting that don't involve artillery.
Well, on that very hopeful note, I think we'll close. I want to really thank the panelists for a lively conversation. We could go on for another 1 hour, but we have to have this hard stop. And also to the panelists, Dr. Boagang here and Dr. Amil Joseph, who've joined us virtually, and once again to Dr. Boagang, who's joining us at 4 a.m. Australia time. Please can we have a round of applause for these panelists? And this concludes the Participedia. Oh, I can see a hand there. We have a really hard stop, but I'll let you go with a question. Do you have a question? Yes, but we don't have time for that now. But if you have one pressing question, I'll take it. I'll just repeat that. So this is a very important question about democratic engagement. The recent election in Ontario, it was said that only 40% of the population, of the electoral population, actually voted. And that's a very deeply concerning trend in a country that prides itself as, an established liberal democracy. And I guess the question is, who are those amongst us that did not vote, and I think it's a pertinent one. I don't know if there's a question there or an observation. Okay, so the message is not to be silent, to be engaged in this democracy that we all treasure, if I'm correct. So on that note, I really have to call it close, and thank you all for being part of this conference and making it successful. Thank you.